How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another change of scenery, 2 videos in a row. Today, we're going to take a look at my first film camera, the Canonet QL17 G3. I spent a lot of time with this camera. It's by no means perfect, but it can certainly be the camera for you in the right situation. It personally taught me a lot about taking photos and was my foundation for shooting film. I've gotten to know it quite well over the years. Its pros and its cons, the things about it that I really like and the things about it that are just kind of okay or neutral, or the things about it that are not so good. So in this video, we're gonna go over a lot of that stuff, and I really want this to be one of those things that tries to help you make a decision and helps you decide if you are one of those people that this camera works for really, really well. Because in the right use case, I find that this camera definitely excels, but I don't think it's perfect for everything. I'm not gonna spend too much time talking about the technical specifications of this camera. That stuff is discussed ad nauseum on the internet, and you can find all of that information elsewhere. In fact, I encourage you that if you're thinking about getting this camera to go seek out and read the manual, and there you'll find all about the technical specifications and features that this camera has. But I am going to start off by talking about the technical specifications that I think are really important to talk about and the things that might help you when it comes to making a decision about buying this camera. So I will say this, when it comes to features and technical specifications, I do find this camera is kind of limited. It doesn't have a lot of the things that some of the more pro-level film cameras have, like exposure compensation, but it definitely has the minimum to get the job done, that's for sure. So first and foremost, the shutter speeds and ISO range is relatively limited. This camera's fastest shutter speed is 1/500th of a second, which is relatively common for rangefinders. And the highest automatic ISO setting that this camera has is ISO 800, which can become a little limiting. It has a 40mm f1.7 fixed lens. Now I find that to be a really useful focal length. I like 40mm and 1.7 is plenty fast. But the one big drawback of this lens is that the close focus distance is really, really poor. This is not a camera you are going to want to buy to use for portraits. It is a terrible portrait camera. The lens is also fixed to the body, meaning that you cannot swap it out for a different lens. So if something goes wrong with the lens, like you develop haze or fungus, or something with the lens breaks, this camera is kind of a brick. You also can't swap it out for different focal lengths, so you better like the 40mm focal length if you're gonna go with this camera. It has the ability to be used in full manual mode without a battery, which is a huge plus for a lot of people. Its automatic mode, however, is shutter priority. I'm gonna get more into that, and I actually already made a separate video addressing the shutter priority of the Canonet. And I think for the right situation, shutter priority can be great. But overall, as an everyday thing, it's not necessarily a thing that photographers really generally like to use. Aperture priority tends to be a bit more useful for general shooting, especially when you're shooting objects. But shutter priority comes into play when you're shooting people, and again, we're gonna get more into that, but it's something that you should know. The quick load system of this camera is one of the most useful features that I have seen in any film camera. Essentially, you wind up loading this thing just like a point and shoot. You put your film in, drag it across, close it, advance, and you're good to go. There's no fiddling with a take-up spool. The camera does all the work for you. It cuts down on the time between rolls significantly, and it's a feature that I really appreciated as a beginner. The battery. This camera uses an old mercury battery that you can't get anymore. There are replacements that will work just fine, but those replacements tend to be a little pricey and tend to not last very long. It's not necessarily a deal breaker in my eyes, but again, something that you should keep in mind. And one last kind of technical thing about this camera is that when you are using it in the shutter priority mode, if the camera thinks that your exposure is incorrect, it will lock the shutter. This comes into play a lot when you're in very bright light. The camera's fastest shutter speed is 1/500th of a second. If you're shooting color negative film and you know that 1 to 2 stops of overexposure is going to be just fine, and that 1/500th of a second is good enough when the camera might think you actually need 1/1000th or 1/2000th of a second, it's going to lock you out from taking that photo. And the only way to take that photo with that extra stop of exposure is to put the camera in its manual mode by moving the aperture ring and shutter speed into the correct position. Then the camera will fire regardless of what the light meter says. It can be a big inconvenience when you know a shot will be well exposed, even if it's a stop, over, or underexposed, and the camera just locks you out from taking that photo. So the technical specifications really add up to a camera that works well for street shooting and not much else. There's really only one type of person that I could recommend this camera to as their primary camera, and that's someone whose focus is doing street photography with people as their main subject. In the other video that I will link above, I talked about how shutter priority really makes sense for this style of shooting. Oftentimes, you're working with moving subjects that are outside of your control, and your goal is to freeze frame them or create motion. And when you set the camera in shutter priority to a specific shutter speed, you are always going to get either the freeze frame effect or motion blur. And I find that that's very useful for street photography, especially when you're taking pictures of people. On the adverse side of that, aperture priority would be much more welcome for taking pictures of things, because more often than not, your depth of field has far more impact on your end result than motion does when you're taking a photo of something that isn't moving. That's really where this camera excels as a primary shooter. If you were someone that was only really doing street photography, if you lived in a big city and you didn't want to pony up the money for a Leica or a Voigtlander, this is a really good option. It's a good secondary camera if you want a rangefinder and already have money invested in a single lens reflex system. It also works well if you want a cheaper, everyday carry, compact camera that has the option for full manual control. It is beginner friendly in a sense. It definitely is not challenging to use, and the quick load system is a huge burden off of the shoulders of beginners. One of the things that beginners tend to mess up a lot is loading their film properly, and the quick load system alleviates that entirely. It's really hard to do it wrong. I think it leaves a lot to be desired though, as you grow as a photographer because of its lack of more pro-level features. It would be great if this camera had exposure compensation and a wider ISO range for its auto modes. So if you're gonna get into this hobby seriously, any SLR camera that has interchangeable lenses is probably a better buy. And if you're not serious and you just want to go around taking film photos, maybe, photos of your friends on outings, then a point and shoot wins out every time. So I think this camera kind of finds itself in a weird place. It works so well for such a specific thing, but for everything else, it's just kind of and there are so many options that are so much better. So now let's talk about how the camera feels. It's not winning any awards for ergonomics, but it doesn't feel bad, that's for sure. Using it in the shutter priority mode feels good. It's quick and snappy to use. The focus throw is very short, and it feels really good when you're lining up your images in the rangefinder pouch. It almost has a feeling of like a rhythm video game where you are waiting for that exact moment for your images to line up and you're pressing your shutter button on the beat in the rhythm game. The rangefinder itself, it's big enough, it's bright enough, gets the job done totally fine, but you might have trouble finding one without haze. Again, that quick load feature cuts down on time between rolls significantly and is an absolute joy to use. I wish all of my film cameras had this camera's quick load feature. The meter is responsive, and I've rarely had issues where the camera was under or overexposing my photos. The shutter is extremely quiet and making the camera very discreet. That's it. I will say, the big downfall in terms of ergonomics in this camera is using it in manual mode. I find it incredibly clunky and very unintuitive. I'm not a huge fan of having all of the controls on the lens barrel, and the dials themselves are kind of thin and a little tough to use, especially with someone who has kind of bigger hands. So to tie it all together, is this thing perfect? No, absolutely not perfect. Is it a great camera for the right situation and the right user? Yes, absolutely. Again, if you are going to be doing street photography, pictures of people in their natural human environment, and you want a relatively cheap, compact shooter with a sharp lens, this is a great option. But does it deserve a lot of the hype surrounding it? I've heard people refer to this camera as a Leica alternative, and I don't think that's true. I don't think that this camera is any better than a lot of the rangefinders that are similar to this camera. I think it has a few distinct advantages that are worth considering if they're going to fit your use case. And overall, to be completely honest, I find myself not using this camera much anymore. I much prefer to use my Olympus XA2 for street photography, and for everything else, I have other cameras that do a better job than the Canonet. That's not to say it's a bad camera. Like I mentioned before, in the right use case, it's great, and it is a solidly built, nice feeling, snappy shooter. But this camera may or may not be for you. And I hope that this video reaffirmed your thoughts about that. If you are one of those people where this camera fits into the specific use case, I hope I helped you make a decision either way. So if you have this camera or you're thinking about picking up one of these cameras, let me know in the comments. And if you've enjoyed this video, please throw me a like, sub, all that wonderful stuff. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for sticking around. I hope this video was helpful if you're looking at the Canonet, and I will see you in the next one.